The war began with a window. On July 30th, 1419, a Hussite procession marched through the streets of Prague's new town. They were led by a priest named Jan Jalivsky, a firebrand preacher whose sermons had been drawing increasingly large and increasingly angry crowds. The procession stopped at the new town hall, where Catholic councillors had recently ordered the arrest of several Hussite preachers. Jalivsky demanded their release. The councillors, watching from the upper floors, refused. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say stones were thrown from the windows, others say insults were exchanged, but the outcome is not in dispute. The crowd surged into the building, seized the councillors, and hurled them from the windows to the street below. Those who survived the fall were beaten to death by the mob. The first defenestration of Prague was not planned as a revolution. It was an eruption, the uncontrolled release of pressure that had been building for years. But its consequences were revolutionary. King Wenceslas IV, already frail and politically exhausted, reportedly suffered a seizure upon hearing the news. He died on August 16, 1419, leaving the Bohemian throne empty and the kingdom without a recognized sovereign. The heir was Sigismund, the betrayer of Hus, the man whose broken promise had sent a priest to the fire. And he expected Bohemia to kneel. Bohemia did not kneel. What happened instead was something medieval Europe had never seen, a popular mobilization that cut across class lines and organized itself for war without waiting for royal permission or aristocratic leadership. Throughout the autumn of 1419 and into 1420, Hussite communities across Bohemia began arming themselves. Peasants forged flails into weapons, miners brought pickaxes and hammers, craftsmen contributed whatever metal they could shape into something lethal. Women joined the marching columns, carrying supplies, tending wounded, and in some documented cases, fighting. The most radical of these communities gathered at a hilltop in southern Bohemia that they renamed Tabor, after the biblical Mount Tabor, where Christ was said to have been transfigured. The Taborites, as they came to be called, represented the extreme wing of the Hussite movement. They rejected not only papal authority, but much of the institutional church itself. They practiced communal ownership of property. They elected their own priests. They believed they were living in the last days before Christ's return, and they intended to purify the world by force if necessary. It was at Tabor that Jan Žižka found his army. Žižka was already old by the standards of his time, somewhere in his 60s, though his exact birth date is uncertain. He was a minor nobleman from southern Bohemia, a professional soldier who had fought in border skirmishes, and, according to some accounts, had been present at the Battle of Grunwald in 1010, where a Polish-Lithuanian army destroyed the Teutonic Knights. He had lost his left eye years earlier, in circumstances the sources do not clearly explain. He was scarred, experienced, and possessed of a tactical mind that would prove to be generations ahead of his contemporaries. What Žižka understood, and what made him unique among military commanders of his era, was that the rules of medieval warfare were not laws of nature, they were conventions, and conventions could be broken. The dominant military technology of the early 14th century was the armored cavalry charge. A mounted knight in full plate armor, riding an armored warhorse carrying a lance, was the medieval equivalent of a main battle tank. He was nearly invulnerable to infantry weapons. He could cover ground at terrifying speed. A disciplined formation of several hundred such knights charging in unison could shatter almost any foot formation in existence. This was the weapon the Pope's crusaders would bring to Bohemia. Thousands of heavily armored horsemen backed by professional crossbowmen and men-at-arms. Žižka had no cavalry to match them. What he had was wagons. The war wagon, the vozová hradba, was Žižka's masterpiece. The concept was deceptively simple. Take ordinary farm wagons, reinforce their sides with heavy wooden planks and iron plating, chain them together in a circle or a line, and fill them with soldiers armed with crossbows, handguns, flails, and polearms. The result was an instant mobile fortress, a wooden wall that could be deployed on any open ground in minutes, creating a defensive perimeter that cavalry could not penetrate. But the wagon fort was not merely a defensive tool. Žižka designed it as an integrated weapons system. Crossbowmen and early gunners fired from behind the wagon walls, picking off attackers at range. When the enemy charge stalled against the barricade, as it inevitably did because horses will not willingly run into a solid wall, infantry armed with flails, halberds, and hooked polearms surged out from between the wagons to attack the disorganized riders. The flail, a peasant's threshing tool modified for combat, was devastatingly effective against plate armor. Its swinging weight concentrated force on a small point, cracking helmets and crushing joints in ways that swords could not. Žižka drilled his farmers relentlessly. He taught them to move the wagons in column on the march and deploy them into defensive formation at speed. He taught them signal discipline, using drums, trumpets, and flags to coordinate movements across a battlefield where visibility was limited by dust and smoke. He taught them to fight as units, not as individuals, subordinating personal courage to collective tactics. In doing so, he created something that Europe would not see again for another century: a disciplined, tactically coordinated infantry force capable of defeating heavy cavalry in open battle. The first great test came on July 14, 1420, at Vítkov Hill. Sigismund had assembled the first crusade against the Hussites, a massive multinational force drawn from across the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, and beyond. Estimates of its size vary wildly in the sources, but it was unquestionably the largest army Bohemia had ever faced. Sigismund's plan was straightforward: march on Prague, crush the heretics, claim his throne, and restore Catholic order. Vítkov Hill, a narrow ridge overlooking Prague from the east, was the key to the city's defense on that side. Žižka fortified it with a small garrison, perhaps a few hundred fighters, behind hastily constructed wooden palisades. The Crusaders attacked with overwhelming numerical superiority. Wave after wave of armored infantry and dismounted knights advanced up the steep slope, expecting to sweep aside what they assumed was a token defense. They were wrong. Žižka's defenders held the hilltop with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. The narrow ridge neutralized the Crusaders' numerical advantage. Only so many men could advance abreast up the slope at one time. The Hussite fighters, many of them women according to several contemporary accounts, used the terrain and their improvised fortifications to repel assault after assault. When the Crusaders finally broke and retreated, the hilltop was littered with their dead. The Battle of Vítkov was not a large engagement by the standards of the 100 Years' War or the later Ottoman campaigns, but its psychological impact was seismic. A papal crusade, blessed by the Church, led by the Emperor, manned by professional soldiers, had been defeated by a scratch force of Czech peasants on a hilltop outside their own capital. The news traveled across Europe at the speed of disbelief. Sigismund withdrew. The First Crusade had failed. It would not be the last. Over the next decade, 4 more crusades were launched against Bohemia. Each was larger than the last. Each was backed by the full spiritual and financial resources of the papacy. Each followed the same basic pattern. A massive army would assemble on Bohemia's borders, march into the mountain passes with trumpets blaring and banners flying, and then disintegrate upon contact with Žižka's wagon forts. The Second Crusade, in 1421, collapsed before a major battle even occurred. Crusading armies advanced into Bohemia from multiple directions, but failed to coordinate their movements. Zizka defeated them in detail, attacking isolated columns before they could unite at engagements near Kutna Hora and Německý Brod. At Německý Brod in January 1422, the retreating Crusaders attempted to flee across the frozen Sazava River. The ice broke. Hundreds drowned in their armor. By 1421, Žižka had lost his remaining eye. He was now completely blind. He did not stop fighting. This fact alone, a totally blind commander continuing to lead armies in the field and winning, strains credulity to the point where modern readers instinctively search for exaggeration. But the sources, both Hussite and Catholic, confirm it. Žižka compensated for his blindness with an extraordinary command structure. Trusted lieutenants described the terrain to him in precise detail, and he issued orders based on a mental map that he assembled from their reports, from his prior knowledge of Bohemian geography, and from a tactical intuition that seemed to operate independent of sight. He rode at the head of his columns, carried in a wagon when the terrain was too rough for horseback, and directed battles through a system of verbal commands relayed by aides positioned along the line. He never lost. Not once. Not blind, not outnumbered, not fighting against the combined military resources of Catholic Europe. From his first engagement to his last, Jan Žižka's battlefield record was undefeated, a claim that very few commanders in the entire history of warfare can make. The Third Crusade, in 1422, ended in similar humiliation for the Catholic forces. The Fourth, in 1427, barely entered Bohemia before the crusading army, reportedly tens of thousands strong, panicked at the sound of Hussite war hymns echoing through the forests and fled without engaging. This phenomenon, which the chronicles record with a mixture of awe and mockery, became known as the Terror of the Hussites, a psychological weapon as effective as any wagon fort. The reputation of the Hussite armies had grown so fearsome that enemy soldiers broke and ran at the mere rumor of their approach. Žižka did not live to see the later Crusades. He died on October 11, 1424, not in battle, but of plague during a campaign in Moravia. According to Hussite tradition, his last wish was that his skin be made into a war drum so that he could continue to lead his soldiers even in death. Whether this is historical fact or patriotic legend, it captures something true about the man's significance. He had become inseparable from the war itself, a symbol so potent that his followers could not imagine fighting without some piece of him still present. After Žižka's death, command passed to Prokop the Great, a former priest turned military leader who proved nearly as capable as his predecessor. Under Prokop, the Hussites did something even more audacious than defending Bohemia. They went on the offensive. Hussite raiding armies, the so-called Beautiful Rides, swept out of Bohemia and into Saxony, Bavaria, Silesia, Brandenburg, and even reached the Baltic coast. These were not mere border raids. They were full-scale military expeditions that devastated Catholic territories, looted monasteries and churches, and demonstrated that the Hussite threat was no longer contained within Bohemia's mountain ring. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1431, was the largest and supposedly the most decisive. A massive imperial army advanced into western Bohemia near the town of Domažlice. The Hussite forces moved to intercept. According to multiple sources, the crusading army heard the sound of the approaching Hussite wagons and the singing of Hussite hymns and broke. The entire army fled before battle was even joined. The rout at Domažlice was the final military humiliation. After 5 crusades, 5 failures, and incalculable expenditure of treasure and life, the Catholic powers of Europe were forced to accept what the battlefield had been telling them for over a decade. Bohemia could not be conquered. The wagon wall had held. The blind general's legacy had endured beyond his death. Peasants with flails had broken the finest cavalry in Christendom not once, but repeatedly, not by luck, but by discipline, innovation, and a willingness to die for something they believed was sacred. But victory on the battlefield does not always mean victory in history. The Hussites had proven they could not be destroyed from outside. The question now was whether they could survive what was coming from within. The fractures, the compromises, and the slow, grinding negotiation that would determine what their revolution actually meant. That question, why everything changed and what the change truly cost, is where we turn next. How did they win? Not once, not by luck. 5 consecutive crusades, backed by the full weight of the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, broken by a kingdom of farmers and miners. The easy answer is Žižka, but Žižka did not conjure an army from nothing. The real answer is a system: military innovation, asymmetric motivation, social organization, and enemy incompetence converging into something no single factor could have produced alone. Start with the war wagon. Modern accounts often treat it as a clever trick. It was not a trick. It was a doctrinal revolution. Medieval warfare was built around the mounted knight, 60 pounds of steel on an armored horse, moving at speed, delivering shock that no infantry formation could absorb. Every army in Europe was organized around this assumption. Training, supply chains, command hierarchies, even the social contract between lord and vassal, all of it radiated outward from the armored horseman as the ultimate instrument of decision on the battlefield. Žižka did not counter the cavalry charge, he made it irrelevant. Chain wagons together, reinforce the sides with planks and iron plating, fill them with crossbowmen, handgunners, and infantry armed with flails and polearms. In minutes, you have a mobile fortress on any terrain. Horses will not charge a solid wall. A dismounted knight attacking a wagon line on foot is no longer a knight. He is a slow, exhausted man in heavy steel, facing rested defenders with weapons designed to exploit every weakness of plate armor. The flail delivered concentrated impact that plate could not absorb. The crossbow punched bolts through steel at close range. The handgun, crude, inaccurate, deafening, panicked horses obscured the field with smoke, and at short distance penetrated armor designed to stop blades. Žižka invented none of these weapons. He invented the system that made them work together. Mobile fortification, combined arms, signal discipline, tactical flexibility integrated into a single operational doctrine. He drilled his men to transition from marching column to wagon fort in minutes. He positioned crossbowmen and gunners to create overlapping fields of fire. He held infantry reserves behind the wagon line, ready to surge through gaps and counterattack at precisely the moment when the enemy charge had spent its momentum and stalled. No European army would fully replicate this level of tactical integration for another century. When it finally reappeared, it would be called the Military Revolution. Žižka had started it 100 years early, with farm carts and threshing tools. But technology does not fight. Men do. And the Hussite soldiers fought with a ferocity that their enemies could not match, for a reason their enemies could not replicate. The crusading armies were coalitions, Bavarian dukes alongside Hungarian lords, alongside Saxon bishops, each with separate commands, separate languages, separate supply lines, separate reasons to be there. Many soldiers were mercenaries or feudal levies. They fought because they were paid or because their lord told them to. When the cost exceeded the reward, when the enemy was fiercer than expected, when the weather turned, when supplies ran low, transactional motivation evaporated. A mercenary who sees his comrades cut down by flail-wielding peasants does the arithmetic quickly. No amount of papal indulgence is worth this. The Hussites fought for God's truth, for the memory of a martyred priest, for the chalice, and for their homes. They were fighting a war they could not afford to lose against enemies who could always go home. This asymmetry, existential stakes versus limited objectives, is one of the oldest patterns in military history, and it operated in Bohemia with textbook clarity. A Hussite farmer defending the hill above his village fights with the knowledge that his family is behind him and that defeat means not merely retreat, but annihilation of his community, his faith, his language, his world. A Bavarian levy attacking that hill fights with the knowledge that his lord's quarrel with Bohemian heretics is, at best, an abstraction. The difference in willingness to absorb punishment, to endure one more hour, to hold one more charge was decisive, again and again and again. The internal organization reinforced this. Hussite units, particularly the Taborites, were bound by communal living, shared worship, and elected leadership. A blacksmith fought beside a minor knight, led by a commander chosen for competence rather than bloodline. This flattened hierarchy produced faster communication, greater cohesion under pressure, and a trust that feudal armies, stratified by birth and enforced by custom, could not replicate. When a Hussite line buckled, the men in it did not look over their shoulders for an escape route. They looked sideways at the men they prayed with, worked with, and shared bread with, and they held. And the enemy never adapted. 5 crusades, the same strategy. Assemble a massive multinational army, march into Bohemia, seek a decisive battle, expect God to deliver victory. When the Hussites won at Witkov, it was dismissed as a fluke. When they won again, it was attributed to bad weather, poor coordination, insufficient piety. When they won a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, the crusade planners doubled down rather than rethink. Larger armies, more money, more strident papal bulls, the same operational template. The Hussites adapted constantly, refining wagon tactics, experimenting with weapons mixes, expanding from defense to deep offensive raids. The Crusaders, trapped by institutional doctrine and a theological framework that could not admit the possibility that God might favor the heretics, did not. Yet, if these factors explain why the Hussites won the war, they do not explain what happened when the fighting stopped. And what happened after may matter more than anything that occurred on the battlefield. The movement was never unified. The ultraquists, the moderate wing, wanted reform within the existing order, communion in both kinds, Czech language preaching, limits on church wealth. They were led by nobles and educated townsmen who saw the Hussite cause as a corrective, not a revolution. The Taborites wanted a new order entirely, communal property, elected leadership, the rejection of church hierarchy, the expectation of Christ's imminent return. They were led by radical preachers and military commanders who saw the war not as a means to better terms with Rome, but as the opening act of a total transformation of human society. As long as crusading armies threatened Prague, these factions cooperated. The external enemy was large enough to hold the coalition together. When the external pressure eased, the fault lines cracked open, not gradually, but with the sudden violence of a dam breaking. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, the Utraquist moderates and their noble allies turned on the Taborite radicals and destroyed them. Prokop the Great was killed. The Taborite field army, the same force that had broken 5 crusades and raided deep into Catholic territory, was shattered by its own former allies on a Bohemian field. Czechs slaughtered Czechs, settling by violence the argument that victory over the Crusaders had only postponed. 2 years later, the Compacts of Basel gave Bohemia what no heretical movement had ever extracted from Rome, a written concession that communion in both kinds was permissible and that certain Hussite practices would be tolerated. It was extraordinary, the Catholic Church formally acknowledging in writing that its monopoly on doctrinal truth had limits. It was also the end of the radical dream. Tabor was dismantled, the communal experiment was dissolved. The peasants who had stood in the wagon lines went back to their fields. The miners went back underground. The nobles reclaimed their estates, their authority, and their comfortable position atop a social order that the Taborites had briefly and terrifyingly threatened to overturn. The revolution had won the war and lost the peace. Or so it seemed, until you look at what it left behind and how far forward its consequences reached. 100 years after Jan Hus burned at Constance, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg and fractured Western Christianity in half. Luther knew about Hus. He had read him. He had encountered Hussite ideas circulating through the German universities, carried by Czech students, traveling preachers, and printed pamphlets that moved along the same trade routes that carried Bohemian silver into the markets of Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Leipzig. And in 1520, when the full implications of his own rebellion became clear, when he realized that his challenge to the indulgence trade was not a minor academic dispute, but a rupture with the institutional church itself, Luther wrote a line that echoes across the centuries like a confession. We are all Hussites, though we did not know it. The statement was not flattery. It was recognition. Everything Luther argued, the supremacy of Scripture over papal authority, the corruption of the indulgence trade, the right of the faithful to access God without institutional mediation, Hus had argued first, a century earlier, in Czech, from a pulpit in Prague. For this he had been burned, and for this his followers had fought a war that 5 crusades could not win. Luther's Reformation did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from soil that Hus had broken and that the Hussite wars had fertilized with blood, ideas, and the proof, unprecedented in European history, that Rome could be defied and survive. This is the first and most measurable legacy of the Hussite wars. They were the dress rehearsal for the Protestant Reformation. The theological arguments, the popular mobilization, the defiance of papal authority, the willingness of ordinary people to die rather than submit, all of it prefigured what would happen across Europe in the 16th century. The Reformation did not begin in 1517. It began in 1415 at a bonfire in Constance. But the Hussite legacy extends beyond theology. The war wagon, Žižka's defining innovation, did not disappear after the wars ended. It entered the military vocabulary of Central and Eastern Europe and influenced defensive tactics for generations. Hungarian armies adopted wagon fort techniques against the Ottomans in the decades following the Hussite Wars. The Cossacks of the Ukrainian steppe used strikingly similar formations, the tabor, a word borrowed directly from the Hussite fortress city, well into the 17th century. Military historians trace a direct line from Žižka's Vozová hradba to the broader infantry revolution that would, over the next 2 centuries, dismantle the dominance of mounted knights and reshape European warfare around disciplined foot soldiers, gunpowder weapons, and field fortifications. The Spanish Tercio, the Dutch countermarch, the Gustavian reforms, all belong to a trajectory that Žižka anticipated with wooden planks and iron nails on the hills of Bohemia. More subtly and more dangerously for the old order, the Hussite wars demonstrated something about the relationship between military power and social structure that medieval Europe had preferred not to confront, that common people, properly organized and motivated, could defeat professional aristocratic armies. This was not merely a military lesson, it was a political one. If peasants could beat knights, then the entire justification for feudal hierarchy, the claim that the warrior class earned its privileges by providing protection the lower orders could not provide for themselves, was exposed as contingent rather than natural. The Hussites did not articulate this argument in philosophical treatises. They articulated it with flails and crossbows on battlefields where the theory was tested and the old order failed. The implications would take centuries to unfold, but they were already present in the smoking aftermath of every crusader rout. The people at the bottom of the hierarchy had proven they did not need the people at the top.
For Bohemia itself, the legacy was more complicated and more painful. The Compacts of Basel gave the kingdom a degree of religious autonomy unique in Europe. For nearly 2 centuries after the wars, Bohemia existed as a hybrid, nominally Catholic, practically Hussite, tolerating a pluralism that the rest of the continent would not achieve until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The Utraquist Church became the dominant institution. The chalice remained the symbol of Bohemian identity. Czech was spoken freely. The memory of Hus was honored openly. In a Europe defined by religious conformity, Bohemia was the exception, the one kingdom where the demand for freedom of conscience had been backed by force and codified in treaty. Then came 1620, the Battle of White Mountain, fought on a low chalk hill just outside Prague on November 8, destroyed Bohemian independence in a single afternoon. An Augsburg army, fighting under the banner of the Counter-Reformation, crushed the forces of the Bohemian Protestant estates in less than 2 hours. The Bohemian king, Frederick of the Palatinate, the so-called Winter King, who had reigned barely a year, fled the city before nightfall. What followed was not merely a military occupation, but a systematic cultural annihilation. 27 leaders of the Bohemian Revolt were executed in the Old Town Square on June 21, 2021. Their heads were displayed on the Charles Bridge. The Czech language was stripped of its official status and replaced by German in courts, schools, and administration. Protestant clergy were expelled en masse. The Bohemian nobility, families that had held their lands for generations, was dispossessed and replaced by German-speaking Catholic loyalists imported from across the Habsburg Empire. The University of Prague was handed to the Jesuits, whose name was scrubbed from public memory. Books were burned, churches were reconsecrated. The Hussite chalice, once displayed with pride, became a symbol to be hidden. For nearly 300 years, under Habsburg rule, Bohemia existed as a province, its language marginalized, its history rewritten by the victors, its identity submerged beneath layers of imperial administration and enforced Catholicism. Generations grew up speaking German in public and Czech only at home, if at all. The Hussite Wars became, in the official telling, a cautionary tale of heresy and disorder, rather than a story of courage and conviction. And yet, the memory survived. It survived in folk songs that villagers sang in Czech when no officials were listening. It survived in underground Protestant communities, the unity of brethren, spiritual descendants of the Hussites, that passed forbidden texts from hand to hand across borders. It survived in the stubborn persistence of the Czech language itself, which refused to die despite every institutional effort to replace it. And it survived in the landscape, in the hilltops where wagon forts had stood, in the churches where the chalice was once raised, in the streets of Prague where the blood of reformers had soaked into the same cobblestones that tourists now walk without knowing what lies beneath. When the Habsburg Empire finally collapsed in 1918 and Czechoslovakia emerged as an independent state, the first symbol the new nation reached for was not a king, not a general, not a flag. It was Jan Hus. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the philosopher-president who founded Czechoslovakia, explicitly invoked Hus as the spiritual ancestor of Czech democracy. The Hussite legacy, reinterpreted, idealized, but fundamentally real, became the foundation story of modern Czech national identity. We are a people who stood against empire, who chose conscience over submission, who paid the price and endured. July 6th, the anniversary of Hus's burning, became a national holiday. The chalice reappeared on monuments and public buildings. The name that the Habsburgs had spent 3 centuries trying to erase was carved into the center of the nation's capital on a bronze statue in the Old Town Square, where it stands today. Even the communist regime that ruled Czechoslovakia from 1948 to 1989 could not resist the gravitational pull of the Hussite narrative. The Marxist interpretation reframed the wars as a class struggle, peasants against feudal oppressors, stripping away the religious dimension but keeping the revolutionary one. Žižka was rehabilitated as a proto-proletarian hero. Tabor was celebrated as an early experiment in communal ownership. The story was distorted, but even in distortion, it retained its power. No regime that claimed to govern the Czech people could afford to ignore the Hussites entirely. Stand in the Old Town Square now. It is spring. The tourists are back. Someone is eating tdelnik. Someone is photographing the astronomical clock. The cobblestones are smooth and pale in the afternoon light. The spires of the teen church rise behind the rooftops like 2 dark fingers pointing at something the city has long since stopped looking at. Prague hums with its rehearsed serenity, and Jan Hus stands in bronze at the center of it all, silent, bearded, gazing south toward nothing in particular. Most of the people passing his statue do not know what happened at Constance. They do not know about the wagon forts or the blind general or the 5 crusades that broke against these hills like waves against a seawall. They do not know that the ground beneath their feet was once the most dangerous place in Christendom, a kingdom that told the Pope, the Emperor, and the assembled might of Catholic Europe that it would not kneel, and then proved it with blood and iron and hymns sung loud enough to make armies flee. 600 years ago, a priest was burned for telling the truth in a language his people could understand. The men who burned him believed they were extinguishing a dangerous idea. They believed that if the body was destroyed completely, ashes scattered, soil removed, no relic left behind, the idea would vanish with it. They were so certain of this that they dumped his remains into the Rhine and went home satisfied. The idea did not vanish. It smoldered through a century of war and compromise and suppression, then erupted again in Wittenberg, in Geneva, in London, in Philadelphia, every time someone stood before power and insisted that conscience was not subject to institutional veto. The line from Huss to Luther, to the Reformation, to the Enlightenment, to the modern concept of individual rights is not a straight line. It bends, it breaks, it disappears underground for decades at a time, but it does not end. The fire at Constance was meant to be an ending. It was a beginning, and the ember 6 centuries later has still not gone out.